What's up and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello! My name is Erica and it's a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, we are going to be chatting about all things Aryan context. Now before we can get into that, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you know every single time I post in the future. But now that you've so kindly joined this nerdy corner of the internet, let's get into the video. So Aryan is a bit of an odd historian, I guess, on a public platform such as YouTube to be discussing. He's not like your hot topic name like Herodotus, Thucydides, etc., but Aryan is an unbelievably important Greek historian. You guys who frequent this channel are constantly asking me for more Alexander the Great content. People are asking me where they can find particular Alexander the Great stories. You know, I recently, I think it was like last year or 2 years ago now. No, I think it was 2 years ago now. Good lord. Either way, I reviewed Mary Renault's books, and those were about Alexander the Great, and people were asking there as well, like, where can we read about him in the ancient sources? That would be Aryan. But before we explain his work on Alexander the Great, I should probably tell you a little bit about him and his full name, because you guys didn't like that I didn't say Cicero's full name at the start of his video. Okay. So Lucius Flavius Arrianus was born around 86 CE or AD, and he dies around 160 CE or AD. Now, he is not Roman, he is Greek, but he was born in Bithynia. If you guys know anything about Caesar, you'll probably know the wording of Bithynia. We'll get to that in a Caesar video. That's like an inside joke for right now. But he's born in Bithynia and he dies in Greece. Now, lots of scholars will tell you that it's certainly he died in Athens. However, just bear in mind that we don't actually know if he died in Athens. We do know that he held his last political post in Athens. He ends up becoming the Archon. However, where he actually died, no one wrote that down. He just basically disappears from the historical record anyways. So we just have inferred from the fact that the last time he's really on record doing something and living, you know, his life is in Athens. I just feel like I needed to put in that little that little note. Much like I say with all of these ancient authors, though, there is no real story from the ancient world that is a rags to riches. And so therefore, even though we don't have a lot of information about how Aryan grew up, his influences, his family, all of that kind of stuff, we know pretty much for certain that he couldn't have been poor, and so therefore his family were of considerable wealth. And not only could they have been considerable wealth when we watch him sort of rise through the ranks and end up becoming the historian that thankfully we have, he also has a great education. So both of those things really point to the idea that his family were wealthy to some degree. Aryan's education goes beyond the classroom though, and actually the first thing we have on record about him, I guess, you know, quote unquote, being taught something, is when he is made a priest of the cult of Demeter and Kore, who's also Persephone. Her name starts as Kore and ends up in Persephone. So he starts off being a priest there, and then he ends up being sent for his schooling. Now, his schooling is really interesting because he ends up being sent to Epirus to study underneath the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. So this is a really important part of his life. It will impact his writing later, but it's also important because of the status of getting that kind of education during this period. But what's most important is that actually when he's studying, he ends up studying alongside the future emperor Hadrian. So again, we have all of these wiggle room places that not only tell us he was wealthy and not only tell us he was incredibly lucky, but also all of these helped him get these massive legs up despite not being technically from and born in the correct quote-unquote place. Remember, we're looking at this as ancient historians through the ancient history map, not a modern sense of what culture and belonging and all that kind of stuff is, because that, guys, we're all ancient historians. This is what you have to do. So Aryan completes his studies, he ends up doing a political career, and this is a very stereotypical Roman political career, honestly. When you look at it down on paper, we think that at about 25 he held a quaestorship, we think at about 27 he held an aedile position. So okay, I know that I keep saying all of these political positions, and I still haven't uploaded that video where I was going to explain all of the political positions of Rome. It's coming, I promise. But basically, he does this pretty bog standardly, and he ends up very long story short, so we don't have to go through all of this, he ends up becoming governor of Cappadocia. Arrian serves in Cappadocia from 131 to 137 CE or AD, and then he ends up moving to Athens, which is, as I said at the start and throughout this video, is the last time that we kind of get that note of his whereabouts and of his political career. Once Arrian retires, he then dedicates his life to his literary writing, and this is where all of his work starts coming out, and he starts becoming a very, very prolific Greek historian. So we do not only have the work on Alexander's campaigns, we have so many other works that I obviously had to write down or else I would forget. We have a work that is called On Hunting and various essays as well, like Periplus, Tactica, the order of battle against the Alans. Not only that, but we have a number of lost works as well by Arrian, including one called Parthica, which was 17 books long at one point, of which 10 treated Trajan's campaigns. We had a book that was all about the history of Bithynia, which was 8 books long, and a work about the aftermath of Alexander the Great's death, which was called The Affairs After Alexander, that was 10 books long. Not only that, but as I mentioned, he did all of his studying with the Stoic philosopher, that actually Arrian ended up publishing this work that was all about the teachings of Epictetus. And this is really important because it becomes later important, oh my lord, it becomes important later on in the Middle Ages, because lots of people in the Middle Ages, this is where my history knowledge gets really, really lackluster. I have no idea what goes in the Middle Ages, but I do know that they kept copying that work on Epictetus because they would use that in like monasteries, and they would learn about the teachings of Epictetus because of Arrian, and so that ended up being like a work that was passed around quite a bit because he had that philosophical writing, and they were like, we need this. Arrian, though, is most famous for the campaigns of Alexander, which is what we will focus on here on the channel. Now, what's really interesting about Arrian's writing as a whole, before I tell you a little bit about the Alexander the Great work, is that Arrian's writing is incredibly similar to Xenophon's writing. Now, it's not as tricksy as Xenophon's writing, but literally he like rewrote so many of Xenophon's work and wrote in a very similar style, to the point where he's often referred to by other ancient authors as the second Xenophon. And some people, even when they write his full name, will add Xenophon in the middle of it because he was so similar. So for example, his work that I mentioned that was on hunting, Xenophon also had a work that was on hunting. So it's just a copy of that, but just updated for his audience. And when it comes to the campaigns of Alexander, the actual name for that book is the Anabasis. Obviously, when we translate that, we put that on a shelf in a bookshop and whatever. We have called it the Campaigns of Alexander because otherwise people are going to be getting confused. The modern world will be getting confused. I would get confused because you would see Anabasis and be like, oh great, I want to read The March of the 10,000 by Xenophon, and then in Teen Tiny Writing it says Arrian. No, we had to change all the titles. It was not going to work if we didn't. When it comes to the campaigns of Alexander, Arrian was obviously an incredible admirer of the general and of the man himself. I mean, who isn't? But Arrian really was one of the first fangirls of Alexander. But unfortunately, as goes with most ancient authors, he's not really fussed about Alexander the Great's character. He doesn't really care about his motivations. And so when you read the text, it is not like Mary Renault's books. It is the complete polar opposite, basically. So when you're reading it, it is very bog standard. It is very much he moves from one place to the other. Arrian is obsessed with how Alexander ended up getting so far, what he ended up doing, and how he did it, rather than the why of the movements themselves. Now, Arrian is where we get all of these really famous episodes from. So if you know, oh god, and now as soon as I said famous episodes, I'm like, are these going to be too niche? I'm going to say them anyways. If you guys want to comment below and be like, I don't know what any of those are, that's fine. I will at some point get to these famous episodes, and then I'll tell you again, they're really famous. So the Gordian Knot, unbelievably famous. Hear about that in Arrian. Him going to the temple of Zeus Amun in North Africa, famous. Him going all the way to India to see the philosophers, one of the most famous things that Alexander the Great did, and thank you, Arrian, for writing it in such detail. Now, despite saying all of that, this text does contain some incredibly fine pieces of like descriptive writing. So in particular, I just mentioned North Africa. That is, I mean, when you read that section of the book and actually he's describing North Africa, he's describing the movements, they are stunning. I mean, like genuinely you read it and it's one of those things when you're reading it and you're like, I wish I wrote that sentence. And another really important element about this text, which we love, is that Arrian is really good at sourcing where he gets his information from, because obviously he's writing much later than Alexander the Great. I mean, then Alexander the Great was alive, not when Alexander the Great was writing, obviously, because that's not what he did. Anyways, so he's really good at sourcing people, and he uses these like odd sources. So we know a lot of like Ptolemy I, for example, is used a lot in Arrian in order to construct this narrative. And I had to make a note. Oh, Aristobulus is the other person that he notes constantly throughout his text. So we know a lot of like where he was getting his source material from, even though those sources don't survive to us. We know that they would have been detailing those things, right? So you know how I'm always talking about like, oh, this text is important because it tells us about this, or we know about this chapter because other people have mentioned it. This is perfect example. Perfect. The Campaigns of Alexander are 7 books long. So remember, 7 chapters long. Really, the main chunk of Alexander the Great's movements are in those 7 books. And the last book is actually called the Indica. Now, this is technically still part of the same narrative, but it is noted as something different because all of a sudden we are in territory that we have never been to before. So the Indica tells us of the customs of India and the voyage of Nearchus in the Persian Gulf, with borrowings from Megasthenes and Eratosthenes. Now, again, all of that is going to make sense as we go through the text. What I'm trying to tell you is that it is an incredibly encompassed piece of narrative, but obviously, even though I've been saying it's amazing and it's fantastic, and I'm so excited to be getting into it and to be diving into all of these notes about Alexander the Great, it does not come without its faults, as every single text does. And part of our job now as ancient historians, you guys know ancient historians if you're watching my channel, is to always be reading the text and be aware of what criticisms come with the text. Now, I've already said that this text is focusing really not on Alexander the Great as a person, but on his movements. That's not really a negative, but that is very important to take into consideration, that we cannot take Alexander the Great's character from the work. So Mary Renaud did that in, what was that, the 60s, the 1960s, that she was like, cool, I'm going to take this work and I'm just going to infuse it with meaning and personality and all of this. The text doesn't do it itself. That wouldn't have been a criticism from the ancient world. They don't care about people as people anyways. They care about what you did. So all in all, this is going to be a really exciting series because Arrian is one that if you are not super into Alexander the Great, you really are probably not going to come across him at all, especially in the classroom. I only did because I took Alexander the Great courses at university, and obviously that was the bulk of our reading. As I keep saying, he's not the only person that writes about Alexander the Great, so that is important, that we do have other people who do reference Alexander the Great. And as well, when you read Mary Renaud, she uses a lot of different source material when it comes to her narrative of Alexander the Great, which was obviously in the 1960s. But in case you're coming from Mary Renaud, not everything that's in Mary Renaud is going to be mentioned in Arrian, but the bulk of the movements are. But I think that's literally everything you need to know about Arrian, which is so exciting because after this, I will be seeing, because now we're coming up to the end of 2024, the whole purpose of doing all of these context videos was to see who is the most popular of the context videos, and next year dive into the series and extrapolate on one of the books, one of the historians that you guys have really been liking, and just kind of moving content that way so that I'm constantly giving you guys things that you want at the pace that you want it and sort of prioritizing who's the most interesting to you guys. So at some point we will be doing Arrian and his campaigns of Alexander. And with that, I will love you and leave you. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on the channel. I'll see you guys then.